My parents practiced, "We miss you" at my door. The camera exposed them. Hey everyone. Before this story unfolds, take a second to breathe because what you're about to hear is not just about betrayal, but about truth revealed when people forget they're being watched. If stories of quiet revenge, delayed justice, and emotional reckoning speak to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where silence speaks louder than screams. This story began on a quiet afternoon when the world felt paused, the kind of stillness that only exists when something is about to break. I had been gone from my parents' lives for over 3 years, not because of distance but because of choice. I left after realizing that love, when conditional, becomes a weapon. I stopped answering calls that came only when they needed reassurance, stopped visiting a house where my presence felt like an obligation rather than a blessing, and slowly built a life that did not require their approval to survive. I lived alone in a modest home, a place that reflected the peace I fought hard to earn. The walls held no shouting, the air carried no guilt, and the silence felt safe. For security, I had installed a camera at my front door not because I expected danger but because I valued control over my space. It became a silent witness, recording moments I never imagined I would one day replay with shaking hands. That afternoon I wasn't home. I was at work, buried in deadlines, unaware that my past was standing right outside my front door rehearsing a lie. The camera notification buzzed my phone, but I ignored it at first, assuming it was another delivery driver or a passing shadow. It wasn't until later that evening when I returned home to the quiet hum of my refrigerator and the familiar comfort of solitude that I noticed the missed alert. Curiosity made me open the app. What I saw rewired something inside me. My parents stood at my door, facing each other instead of the camera, their faces tight with concentration. They weren't knocking. They weren't calling my name. They were practicing. Their mouths moved carefully, their expressions shifting between forced sadness and rehearsed concern. Their hands gestured, paused, corrected. They repeated the same words again and again, adjusting tone, posture, and timing like actors preparing for a scene. The words were clear even without sound. They missed me. They worried about me. They wanted me back. Except they didn't know I could see them. The camera captured everything. The way they reset their expressions, the irritation that flashed when one of them stumbled, the impatience that replaced sorrow the moment they thought they'd failed the performance. There was no urgency, no fear, no real emotion behind their eyes. Just strategy. My hands trembled as I watched them finally turn toward the door, knock softly, and deliver the practiced performance with perfect synchronization. Concern painted across their faces, their bodies leaning toward the door as if love itself pulled them forward. When no one answered, they waited, then knocked again, louder this time, adding desperation to the act. Eventually they gave up and walked away. And just before leaving the camera's view, the performance dropped completely. Their shoulders relaxed. Their faces hardened. The concern vanished like smoke. I sat on my couch long after the video ended, the room around me fading into nothing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't awkwardness or poor communication. It was proof. Proof that the apologies I had once begged for were nothing more than tools. Proof that the words I had waited years to hear were being rehearsed like lines in a play. That night, memories flooded back with brutal clarity. Childhood moments when affection followed obedience. Teenage years where approval came only after compliance. Adult conversations where my pain was dismissed as exaggeration, my boundaries treated like betrayal. I remembered how quickly they played the role of caring parents when others were watching, how their warmth disappeared behind closed doors. The camera hadn't just recorded a moment. It exposed a pattern. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Something colder settled in my chest, something sharp and steady. For the first time, I wasn't questioning my decision to walk away. I wasn't wondering if I had been too harsh, too sensitive, too unforgiving. I had evidence now. Not for them but for myself. I saved the footage. Backed it up. Watched it again, this time without shaking. Each replay stripped another layer of illusion away. The people who raised me were not reaching out from love. They were reaching out because control had slipped through their fingers and they wanted it back. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. As the night deepened, a plan began to form, not one of confrontation or explosive revenge, but something quieter, something far more powerful. I wasn't going to expose them publicly. I wasn't going to send the footage with an angry message attached. I was going to let them believe the performance had failed because I wasn't ready. Because the truth was I was preparing. The camera at my door had given me clarity, and clarity is dangerous in the hands of someone who has nothing left to lose. The next time my parents tried to rewrite the narrative, I would be ready to let them play their parts, unaware that the stage was no longer theirs. And as I turned off the lights and walked toward my bedroom, I knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were quiet but not empty. Silence wrapped around my life like a deliberate choice, no longer a wound but a shield. I went to work, cooked my meals, watered my plants, and slept soundly, all while carrying a secret that felt heavier with every passing hour. The footage stayed untouched, locked away, but its presence shaped every thought I had. It wasn't anger driving me anymore. It was awareness. My parents didn't return immediately. Instead, they shifted tactics the way manipulators always do when the first attempt fails. Messages began to appear, carefully spaced, each one crafted to sound spontaneous but familiar in rhythm. They spoke about family, about time passing too quickly, about how life was fragile and forgiveness was necessary. I read every word without replying, recognizing the same rehearsed tone I had seen on camera. What they didn't know was that my silence wasn't confusion. It was calculation. I started to reflect on how often my reactions had been used against me in the past. When I confronted them, I was labeled emotional. When I withdrew, I was accused of cruelty. They had always controlled the story by controlling my responses. This time I gave them nothing to work with. Weeks passed and then they returned. The camera notification buzzed again, and this time I opened it immediately. There they were, standing at my door once more, but something was different. They weren't practicing. They were arguing quietly, their frustration leaking through clenched jaws and stiff movements. The confidence they once had was cracking. They knocked. Waited. Knocked again. Later that night, another message arrived, heavier this time, layered with guilt and urgency. They spoke about how worried they were, how my absence was hurting them, how they didn't understand why I was doing this to the family. Reading it felt like watching a familiar movie with the ending already spoiled. So I didn't respond. Instead, I began preparing in ways they would never expect. I gathered old emails, voicemails, and messages, pieces of communication that revealed patterns of manipulation and conditional love. I didn't do this to expose them online or to friends. I did it to anchor myself to the truth, so I could never again be gaslit into believing my pain was imaginary. The footage from the door camera became the centerpiece of that truth. It reminded me that the warmth they offered now was no more real than the rehearsed sorrow they practiced when they thought no one was watching. As the weeks stretched on, the messages grew sharper. Concern turned into accusation. Love turned into obligation. They spoke about everything they had done for me, everything I owed them, everything I was destroying by staying away. Each word confirmed what the camera had already shown me. They weren't missing me. They were missing control. One evening, I sat alone, the glow of my phone lighting the room as I rewatched the footage once again. This time I noticed something new. It wasn't just the performance that stood out, but the moment right after they finished rehearsing when they both looked relieved. As if pretending to care was exhausting and they were glad to be done with it. That was the moment I decided how this would end. I would let them come back into my life just enough to believe their performance had worked. I would give them space to speak, to explain, to promise. And when the time was right, when the masks were fully in place and the audience was set, I would show them what it meant to be truly seen. Not with anger. Not with shouting. With truth. The silence I had maintained wasn't weakness. It was preparation. And as I finally typed my first response after months of absence, a simple message that reopened the door they thought they had lost, I knew the balance of power had shifted. They believed the story was theirs to tell. They had no idea the camera had already written the ending. Reconnection did not happen loudly. It arrived quietly, disguised as progress, wrapped in the illusion of healing. After my short response, carefully neutral and deliberately hopeful, my parents reacted exactly as expected. Relief poured through their messages, not relief for my well-being, but relief that the door they feared permanently closed had cracked open again. They moved quickly as if afraid I might change my mind, suggesting a meeting framed as gentle, pressure-free, and purely about love. I agreed, but on my terms. I chose a public place, neutral ground where walls could not absorb secrets and silence could not be weaponized against me. A quiet cafe with large windows, where sunlight exposed everything and escape was always possible. The choice itself unsettled them, though they tried to mask it with enthusiasm. Control slips often reveal themselves through discomfort. When the day arrived, I felt calm in a way I never had before. Not numb, not detached, but steady. I wasn't going in as a child seeking approval or an adult craving closure. I was going in as an observer, someone who already knew the ending and was simply watching the performance play out. They arrived early. I saw them through the glass before I entered, seated side by side, posture rehearsed, expressions soft but alert. They looked exactly like they had in the camera footage. Concern carefully arranged, warmth dialed to a believable level. Seeing it in person confirmed what I already knew. The performance wasn't situational. It was instinctive. As I joined them, they leaned forward in perfect unison, faces mirroring relief and restrained emotion. Their eyes searched my face not for how I was feeling but for how much power they still had. I gave them nothing. I was polite, reserved, and distant the way one is with strangers who share a history. They spoke at length, filling the space with reflections about family, regret, and time lost. They acknowledged mistakes without naming them, apologized without specificity, and expressed love without accountability. Every word was chosen carefully, designed to sound deep while committing to nothing. It was a masterclass in emotional vagueness. I listened. Listening had always been my weakness before because it came paired with hope. This time it came with clarity. I noticed how they spoke more about their pain than mine, how their regret centered on discomfort rather than damage. They framed my absence as something that happened to them, something they endured, something they survived. At no point did they ask what I needed. They spoke about wanting to rebuild, about moving forward, about letting go of the past. That phrase lingered in the air like a demand disguised as wisdom. Letting go, in their language, had always meant forgetting without resolution, forgiving without change, returning to the same patterns under a new name. I nodded. I allowed them to believe the words were landing. The conversation ended with tentative plans to meet again. They left smiling, confident, reassured that their strategy had worked. As they walked away, I caught a glimpse of relief on their faces, the same relief I had seen on camera after rehearsing. The same drop of tension, the same sense of completion. They thought they had won something back. What they didn't realize was that the reunion was never about reconciliation. It was about confirmation. I needed to see with my own eyes that the people in the footage were the same people sitting across from me now. I needed to know that time had not softened them, that distance had not inspired reflection, that losing me had not taught them empathy. It hadn't. Over the following weeks, we met a few more times, always in public, always controlled. Each meeting followed the same pattern. They performed concern, I performed receptiveness. They offered conditional warmth, I offered polite distance. They tested boundaries subtly, slipping in expectations, revisiting old narratives, reframing past events in ways that favored them. Each time I noted everything. The most revealing moments weren't what they said but what they avoided. They never acknowledged specific harm. They never asked how their actions had shaped my life. They never expressed curiosity about who I had become without them. To them, I was not a person to rediscover but a role to reinstate. The realization settled deeply. They didn't miss me as I was. They missed who I had been when I was easier to manage. One evening, after another carefully staged meeting, I returned home and sat alone in the quiet. I opened the camera footage once more, then compared it to the memories of the day. The overlap was undeniable. Same expressions. Same tone. Same emotional choreography. The camera had shown me who they were when they thought I wasn't watching. The reunion showed me who they were when they knew I was. There was no difference. That night I made the final decision. This was not going to end with confrontation or exposure. It was going to end with something far more unsettling for them. Withdrawal with truth intact. I would not argue. I would not accuse. I would not beg them to understand. I would let them see, slowly and unmistakably, that access to me was no longer automatic, and that no performance, no matter how well rehearsed, could earn back what they never valued until it was gone. The final step would require timing, precision, and one moment of undeniable clarity. A moment where the mask could no longer be adjusted or defended. A moment where silence would speak louder than any accusation. And as I prepared for that moment, I understood something that changed everything. The camera had exposed them. But what was coming next would force them to confront themselves. By the time I moved into the next phase, I no longer felt fear, guilt, or confusion. Those emotions had already burned away, leaving behind something calmer and far more dangerous: certainty. Certainty does not rush. It waits. It watches. And it chooses the exact moment to act. I didn't change suddenly. That was important. I allowed my parents to believe progress was happening naturally. I replied a little faster. I shared harmless details about my life. I let warmth creep into my tone just enough to reassure them. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like healing. To them, it felt like success. And success made them careless. They began to relax into old habits, the ones they assumed I wouldn't notice anymore. Expectations slipped into conversations disguised as suggestions. Subtle comparisons surfaced, reminding me of how things used to be when I was more agreeable. They spoke about family gatherings, about appearances, about how nice it would look if everything was normal again. Normal had always been their favorite word. What they didn't realize was that every step forward they thought they were taking was actually leading them deeper into a space they couldn't control. I wasn't rebuilding trust. I was observing consistency. I was watching to see if behavior matched intention. It didn't. The turning point came during a conversation that was meant to be insignificant. A casual exchange, nothing heavy, nothing emotional. That's where the truth usually leaks out, when people aren't trying so hard to hide it. One small comment revealed more than hours of rehearsed concern ever could. It carried entitlement. The assumption that my return meant restoration of the old hierarchy. In that moment, something shifted. I didn't correct them. I didn't react. I let the comment pass as if unnoticed. But inside, the final piece clicked into place. They hadn't changed because they didn't believe they needed to. In their minds, time had simply reset the board. They were waiting for me to fall back into position. That was when I knew it was time. Not for exposure. Not for confrontation. But for closure on my terms. I began pulling back in ways that couldn't be accused of cruelty. I shortened replies. Declined invitations politely. Maintained kindness without availability. It was subtle, gradual, impossible to argue against without revealing their expectations outright. And that's when the cracks started to show. Confusion replaced confidence. Their messages grew more frequent, their tone shifting between concern and irritation. They asked what was wrong while insisting nothing should be wrong. They spoke about effort and sacrifice, implying imbalance without naming it. The performance was unraveling. One evening, as I sat alone in my living room, the door camera notification appeared again. I hadn't told them I would be home. I hadn't invited them. And yet, there they were, standing on my porch like a memory that refused to stay buried. This time there was no rehearsal. Their body language was tense, restless. They knocked sooner, harder. They waited less. Their faces showed impatience before concern could be assembled. Whatever script they had prepared was incomplete. I didn't open the door. I watched from inside, unseen, as the camera captured everything once more. The sighs. The glances. The frustration when the door remained closed. And then, just like before, the masks fell. The disappointment on their faces had nothing to do with missing me. It was the disappointment of a plan failing, of control slipping again. One of them gestured sharply, the other shook their head. They turned away not in sadness but in annoyance. It was the clearest footage yet. Later that night, messages arrived, confused, wounded, carefully framed to place responsibility back in my hands. They spoke about how hard they were trying, how unfair the distance felt, how confusing my behavior was becoming. They were losing patience. And that was exactly what I needed. I didn't respond immediately. I let time stretch, let uncertainty sit with them the way it had once sat with me. When I finally replied, it was calm, measured, and final in tone. I told them I needed space. Real space. Not punishment. Not drama. Just distance. They didn't accept it gracefully. The replies came fast, layered with emotion, justification, and self-defense. They spoke about misunderstanding, about intention, about how hurt they felt. Reading their words felt like watching the same scene from a different angle. Still no accountability. Still no curiosity. Still no acknowledgement of the harm beneath the surface. That was the moment I decided to end the story. Not with a bang but with a mirror. I prepared one last thing. Not a speech. Not an accusation. Just evidence. The footage from my door, unedited, untouched, time-stamped. Not sent in anger. Not accompanied by commentary. Simply presented. I didn't send it yet. Some truths need the right silence around them to land. As I sat there holding my phone, I realized something profound. Closure does not require agreement. Healing does not require apology. And freedom does not come from being understood by those who benefit from misunderstanding you. The camera had shown me who they were when they thought I wasn't watching. Now, I was ready to show them who they had been when they thought I wasn't listening. I waited before sending the footage, not because I doubted myself, but because timing matters when truth is involved. Truth delivered too early becomes noise. Truth delivered at the right moment becomes undeniable. I needed them to sit in their confusion a little longer, to exhaust their explanations, to run out of narratives that painted them as victims of my distance. And they did. The messages slowed, then intensified, then fractured. Concern turned into defensiveness. Defensiveness turned into blame. Blame tried to disguise itself as disappointment. Each shift revealed something new, something rawer, something closer to the reality I had always known but never been allowed to name. They asked what they had done wrong, not to understand but to correct the story. They insisted they had always loved me, always supported me, always been there. The repetition itself felt rehearsed, like lines memorized long ago and repeated whenever the script demanded reassurance. That was when I sent it. No warning. No explanation. No emotional framing. Just the video file. The footage spoke for itself. I imagined them opening it, expecting perhaps a misunderstanding, a minor moment taken out of context. I imagined the confusion as they watched themselves standing at my door, not knocking, not calling, but practicing. I imagined the tightening in their chests as recognition set in, the realization that there was no alternate version of this moment that could save them. They couldn't deny what they saw. They couldn't explain it away. They couldn't accuse me of exaggeration or misremembering. The camera had no bias. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then longer. For the first time in my life they had nothing to say. The silence stretched, heavy and unfamiliar, and I knew that whatever was happening on the other side of that screen was not performance anymore. It was collapse. When the response finally came, it wasn't an apology. It was outrage. They questioned why I had a camera, as if surveillance were the betrayal rather than the behavior it revealed. They accused me of spying, of mistrust, of cruelty for holding on to something they believed should have remained unseen. They spoke about intention, about joking, about practicing how to communicate better. They never addressed the act itself. That was the moment everything became clear in a way that hurt less than I expected. I had always thought the most painful thing would be hearing the truth. I was wrong. The most painful thing was realizing they had seen the truth and still refused to meet it. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Days passed and the messages stopped. Whether from shame, anger, or the realization that the usual tactics would no longer work, I didn't know. What I did know was that something had ended. Not just contact but hope. The kind of hope that keeps people trapped in cycles of self-doubt and longing. And oddly enough, that ending felt like relief. Without the constant pull of expectation, my life expanded quietly. Mornings felt lighter. Evenings felt calmer. I stopped bracing myself for emotional impact that never came. The absence of their voices created space for my own thoughts to grow louder, clearer, more confident. I didn't block them immediately. I didn't need to. Their power had been rooted in access, and access was gone. Over time, I archived the conversations, then deleted them altogether. Not in anger but in acceptance. The camera at my door remained still and watchful, but it no longer felt like a safeguard against intrusion. It felt like a symbol. A reminder that the truth exists whether people acknowledge it or not, and that sometimes the greatest protection comes from seeing clearly. I thought often about that first day, about the moment I opened the app and saw them rehearsing words I had once prayed to hear. I realized something important in hindsight. If I had opened the door that day, if I had believed the performance, I might have returned to the same emotional cage, convinced that love had finally arrived. The camera saved me from that. Not because it exposed them to the world, but because it exposed them to me. There was no dramatic final conversation. No tearful resolution. No transformation on their part. And that was okay. Not every story ends with redemption. Some end with release. I didn't need them to understand me. I needed to understand myself. And what I understood finally was this. Love does not require rehearsal. Care does not need witnesses. And people who truly miss you don't practice what they'll say when you're not there to hear it. They knock. They wait. They mean it. As I moved forward, Building a life grounded in truth rather than longing, I felt something settle deep within me. A quiet strength unshaken by guilt or expectation. The past no longer followed me to the door because I had stopped answering it. And that was the real ending. Not revenge. Not exposure. But freedom. This concludes the story on Black Queen Dominion, where truth always finds its way into the light, even when it arrives through a silent lens.